Okay, good morning, everyone. Aha! Perfect. Excellent. I decided to dress casually today, so I would match everyone. Great. So, you might have noticed my title is a little bit critical. So I think I should explain where this title is coming from. First off, from my perspective, the way that we're working now, I think cybersecurity is failing very badly. Okay, please let me explain. First off, I come from a more technical background. I'm a data structure reverse engineer. That's kind of my area. But I now work for United Nations, specifically the Office on Drugs and Crime. So I'm more on the criminal investigation side of things. And instead of looking at just data structures and security vulnerabilities and how hackers work, I'm looking at societies and how we're working on security in the society. Okay. Now, how did I come to this presentation? First off, whenever I was kindly asked to give this talk, I was thinking about what can I share with this community, an amazing community. I've seen the agenda. The talks here are fantastic, but you're a very technical community. And whenever I was working on technical things, I had the idea that if I can make one application a little bit more secure, then I can make people more secure, right? I mean, if we can get our bug fixes in, then we're securing people who are using those services, right? Well, now my job is working mostly with governments to secure people through governments. As I was asked, what are you going to talk about in this presentation, I was trying to think about what would be the most useful for you. And I had just had basically a tour where every day I would go to a different government agency in countries mostly in Southeast Asia. And I would talk to these agencies about what their needs are for security, what their needs are for criminal justice, how can they improve their economies. We're talking about all of these different things. And it was in the second week of this tour that I started seeing the pattern that governments that I was speaking to, not just one, multiple governments, and all of the agencies in those governments, they were all desperate for security. Desperate for it. Even if those governments have certs, maybe they have security agencies, but the governments themselves, the people I was talking to, and especially the public, whenever I would speak to the public, still had no clue about cybersecurity and where to begin. So you're going to be talking this week about some really intense technical topics that are state of the art. But the reality is, if you zoom out and you look at where most governments and most people are, think about your friends that aren't in the tech community. Where are most people in terms of cybersecurity? Left behind, right? So I want to give this talk not to depress you, hopefully, but to make you hopefully rethink your perspective a little bit. It's not just about the data. It's not just about securing one organization. If we're not helping everyone, we're losing the security battle, and I'll tell you what that means from my perspective. So, one big indicator that I can objectively say we are losing the security battle is billions of US dollars lost to online scams and fraud in 2023. You scammed them? Okay, he has the billions. All right, cool. So billions of lost in US dollars to online scams and fraud. That's just 2023. Scam centers, especially in the Mekong region, are just wreaking havoc on the world. But it's not just Mekong. We're seeing a lot of scam centers pop up in now Africa, a little bit more in the Pacific, some starting in Latin America. These are organized businesses that are making a lot of money I can't say high tech, but they know how to use technology. But mostly it's social engineering. Okay? So billions of dollars lost to online scams and fraud, and that's just scams. That's not ransomware. That's not normal hacking. That's not state actors, anything like that. Okay? A quote from Singapore law enforcement head of the scam center. In the course of our investigations work, we've seen heartbreaking incidents where victims sink into bouts of depression, self-harm, and even eventually potentially suicide. And this is a growing epidemic. When people get scammed, even if they lose $10, $20, whatever it is, it really makes you feel vulnerable and it makes you feel depressed. But because so many people are being affected by scams now, mental health of these victims is really going down. And that's extremely affecting suicide rates in young people especially, right? So we're talking about security, but we can't even stop basic scams from happening. This is one of our issues. Ransomware, I just threw it down there just to kind of give some context. Ransomware last year, only related to cryptocurrency transactions, hit $1.1 billion US globally in 2023. So, ransomware is $1.1 billion. Scams, last time I checked, is estimated around $20 to $25 billion USD per year. These are major operations, major companies essentially running around profiting off of this. That's organized crime groups. Okay? Now, whenever I was starting to think about this, I would have approached this from the application perspective. I'd say, okay, where are the scams coming in at? Oh, our bank applications. Mobile banking is insecure. How can we secure it? Okay, multi-factor authentication, stronger encryption protocols, all of these things. They haven't worked because the device itself is insecure. Social engineering is very effective still, right? Everyone here I think knows you can hack anyone, right? So now take that mentality about your skills in your ability to hack somebody or socially engineer them, and then apply that to a farmer in a countryside who just lost their life savings. How are we supposed to secure that endpoint? And I think it's the way that we conceptualize security in general that makes us a little bit more vulnerable. So to go back a little bit, why am I talking about this? First off, I'm Joshua James. I work for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I'm in charge of Asia and the Pacific in our program, specifically related to cybercrime investigations. I'm based in Bangkok. So anyone from Thailand? No one from Thailand? Come on, it's so close. Okay, next year, all right. So my background is in network security, bachelor's. I have a PhD in computer science, mostly on digital forensic investigation, and then I worked with criminal justice is essentially my area that I work on now. And what do I mean by criminal justice? I work with the global program on cybercrime in the UN, and I kind of expected nobody here knows what the UN does. You might have heard about it, but maybe you don't know. Okay, so my program specifically, basically all of the countries that are members of the UN, they're my boss. So if your country is a member of the UN, you're my boss, okay? You tell me what to do. Under this program, we've been instructed that we need to help countries solve cybercrime investigations, like teach countries how to actually do that, give resources for that. Digital forensic investigation, we need to work on digital evidence and what digital evidence actually means in court, how to argue that. Child online sexual exploitation is under our kind of area, huge problem in the region. Virtual asset investigations now, and then all types of prevention. And within the region recently, we've been talking a lot more about critical infrastructure protection. This starts to get into kind of nation state, maybe even military, national security kind of things. So we're very hesitant to get into that because we don't do anything intelligence military, basically. That's not the role of the UN. Okay. United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime specifically, I work on criminal justice development, which means whenever a country is having a problem, for example, hacking. The country's getting hacked, the country's trying to deal with ransomware, the country's trying to deal with scams. How do we actually get a criminal justice system that can respond to that? Now, if you're a professional hacker, you're probably thinking, oh no, I don't want police to be able to find it. But basically, we're the ones that teach law enforcement in some countries how to respond, and we get them resources so they can do it. We do that through practical skills, so there's lots of training and education companies. We also do a lot of training and education of law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, lawmakers, even the public. We help shape and write legislation for countries. So they come to us saying, what are other countries doing in this legislation? What laws should we put in place to try to reduce types of crime? And then, of course, we also work on treaties, which are basically agreements between countries to work on different things. So that's the kind of stuff we do. Now, you might have heard before about ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. It's also part of the UN family, and they mostly work on standards and information security. So it's kind of like our sister company. We work together. And then you might have heard, especially if you're from Singapore, about Interpol. Anyone work with Interpol? Anyone from Interpol? Okay, competition? Okay, good. We compete a little bit, but not really. So Interpol is not part of the UN, but they have a specific role that is more operational. UN and Interpol are non-operational. We have no jurisdiction in any country to work directly, but we can advise law enforcement. Okay, so Interpol is more on the law enforcement advisory, so they can potentially go on scene and say, you shouldn't touch that, right? Whereas UN is mostly kind of treaty level, more on the training side. Okay, so that's a little bit about how we work and what we do. Now, what I've been seeing, especially around scam centers, is that organized crime groups really in the region, especially Asia and Pacific, whenever we see organized criminal infrastructure, especially around money laundering, they normally have a security team. Right? They have people who know security, they are implementing best practices, and they have a lot of money to throw at the security problem because they have a lot of assets to protect. Okay? Now, in general, criminal organizations, if they're not really organized crime groups, they're just as insecure as everyone else. But real organized crime groups invest in security a lot. They use the same tools and techniques we do. In the morning, you heard hackers know your, Hackers know your education or your training. They know your course contents, right? Hackers really know. Organized crime groups are sending people to master's and PhD programs for reverse engineering, for computer science, for all sorts of things. It's an investment for them, and they have the resources to invest because they're making billions per year. So as we look, especially at the scam centers that are getting busted, there tends to be people who really know information security are somehow involved in this process. It's usually wherever they're securing money flows. Now this brings up an observation. Just like security conferences are getting more expensive to run, information security is really expensive. Information security is really expensive. And you're thinking, all these tools are free on GitHub. How is it expensive? No. I mean, you could potentially set up some really interesting stuff if you have knowledge just with free tools from GitHub. But really, to do information security properly, to secure infrastructure properly, it's extremely expensive. And most countries can't afford to do it properly. Most countries can't afford to do it properly. So the wealthy can afford security, and we really target the wealthy. That's where the money is, and that's good business practice. Of course we're going to target the wealthy. They have assets to protect. We need to protect them. Okay? But the majority of the world is not wealthy. And we are not even really thinking about them. They're not on our radar, except maybe as a threat vector. So what I'm concerned that we're getting to is that wherever the wealth is, that's where we'll focus, and everyone else is a threat. But that's not how societies work, right? If that's how societies work, we're really going to have problems because everyone's a threat. Okay? Wealthy can afford security basically in terms of new technology. Imagine having a phone that's like 5 years old and then you stop getting security patches because you just can't support the hardware anymore. Well, not everyone can afford a phone every 5 years, right? Now, I lived in Korea. Koreans will switch their phone every year, maybe every 2 years, no problem. Switch. But a lot of countries that I'm in, they're still on very old versions of phones that will never have security updates again because they can't afford to switch. It's a huge investment for them, right? So wealthy can afford new technologies which get better security focus. Maintenance. Everything is going to a subscription-based model. Subscriptions are really expensive. Crazy expensive. And if you're wealthy, you can afford the maintenance costs of these things. If you're not wealthy, you go without the security updates. So now we've intentionally, not intentionally, but I guess because of cost, have opened up a whole new threat vector for actors to be able to take over devices and then use those as channels to attack our infrastructure. We just gave the bad guys an entirely new vector to go after us because we want those fees, basically. And then the biggest point of this is education. Like I said, if you give me GitHub and like a couple months, I can probably have a pretty interesting security system set up because I know how. I know how to code. I know what I'm trying to do. I know how to analyze network traffic. I know all of these things, right? I have education, so that means I can take advantage of the resources that are there. But actually, Nikolai is just here, and the first conference that we met in, 10 years ago, I think, we were specifically talking about providing computers to places that have never had access to technology before. And the issue was, you can provide the computers, you can say, information that you need is on these websites. But the people who were using the computers didn't know how to study that information. They hadn't been educated on how to get educated. And that was a huge discussion about development in developing countries especially. How do we educate people how to learn? From Singapore, you're probably like, isn't it obvious? Like, this is just what we do, right? We study all the time, we get yelled at, and that's it. Okay. So, no. Like, a lot of cultures, a lot of countries don't have let's say, that culture or that ability to learn baked in. And they have to learn that. Everyone has to learn how to learn. So, the wealthy can afford security, and the biggest point of that is on the education side. How do we get people to learn to be able to support themselves? Okay. In wealthy countries, not usually an issue. In less wealthy country, it is a big issue. So since we're talking about security, we're talking about risks, assets, and scale. In the cybersecurity approach, we're basically trying to protect assets, like I said. So we focus on assets and we say, what is the value of that asset? How much should we actually be investing to secure that asset? If it's worth a lot, we need to spend more potentially to secure it. This is kind of a calculus that most of us tend to do. And that's really good whenever you're trying to centralize security. So if you look at all the cloud models, we're trying to centralize everything, centralize control, get all of our logs into one place so we can analyze them, right? Everything information security is really going centralized because we want to lock down and control everything. The problem is that model doesn't scale to real life. It scales to a network, maybe even an enterprise. But whenever you're talking about real life, real societies, that doesn't scale. And the greatest asset any country has is its people. I have never heard of a security risk assessment say that people are an asset. They're always a liability. 100%. No, right? It's always a liability. But for a country, the whole point of that governance system, depending on how the government's set up, is to secure those assets and make sure that life is as good as possible, basically, more or less, right? So whenever you're looking at the country level, the people are the assets, but we're not including them in those kind of risk evaluations. Now, the problem with people in general is that they're highly distributed. Right? You have an extremely distributed system. Centralization in most countries is impossible. People in countrysides, people in cityscapes, like people are just distributed everywhere. Individually, low value. So think about if you have each person in your country is an asset. If we apply traditional security models where we're looking at the value of the asset versus how much we invest in it, if you have one citizen, how much should you be investing in the security of that one citizen? I don't think anyone applies that calculus. Right? It doesn't make any sense. Now, also the issue is, what if that citizen is a poor person whose entire life savings is $1,000? To them, that $1,000 really matters. In the scope of the government, that $1,000 might not even be a blip. Right? So how do you make that calculation? And right now, we're not making that calculation. Right? So all together, of course, all citizens together, basically high value. So we have law enforcement, we have legislation, we have all of these different things that we try to implement to try to control and protect these assets as much as you can. But each individual asset is completely distributed, working on its own relatively independently. Now, this reminded me of the zero trust model, which I talked about a little bit this morning. Zero trust model, basically don't trust anything and then always verify. And this is really what I see a lot of governments or legislators starting to talk about is we need an online identity system so that way we know exactly who everyone is so we can control all this stuff. And I'm like, it'll never work. We can't even get driver's licenses done properly. How are we going to get online identity systems? It makes no sense to me. Zero trust in the real world, let's say human verification is extremely poor. I think most people in here probably know you can get around a lot of verification systems. Right now we have a lot of bad technology. It's extremely difficult for most people to use for verification, and then it's very unevenly distributed. Again, it comes back to access and education, which a lot of countries don't have. Right? You might be able to implement it in Singapore, but in most countries, impossible. Impossible to do properly, let's say. Sometimes relies on a functioning national ID system. Most countries, even if their national ID system is kind of working, corruption can still kind of bypass that, so it doesn't really matter. Like, you can always get around it. And then the biggest thing is that human verification systems are not secure themselves. I've had a lot of verification systems that I've been forced to use to access services to find out 2 months later that they've been hacked. So the security verification systems themselves are insecure, right? Because everything can be hacked. So if all of my personal identifying information is leaked, how secure is the verification? Okay, I think we all know this. So Human verification is extremely, extremely difficult. And that, of course, affects how we're going to do it. Now, what I'm seeing a lot, and really what's happening in terms of scams, and I'm using scams just as an example. There's a lot of other types of crime that are happening right now, especially cybercrime, that are causing this kind of issue. Basically, what's happening to law enforcement around the world is some type of distributed denial of service. We have a lot of very small crimes happening to an unprotected endpoint, which is our citizens, for a very small amount of money, right? To open up a case to investigate that would cost more than the amount of money that was lost. So economically, it makes 0 sense for law enforcement to start an investigation, right? It's just too much waste of money. Many small cases, most of these cases are cross-border, which means if it happens, if I'm the victim in my country, but the money or the suspect is in a different country, my country has to work with the other country. And I don't know if you know this, but countries don't work together very well. They don't tend to like each other very much, right? They focus on themselves way more than they focus on collaboration in most cases. So it's almost always cross-border, which means it's much more complex to investigate. Complexity means more expensive. So now, for $20 that were stolen, I'm already minus, $15,000 to open an investigation and make it international. So economically, it makes no sense. Instant fund transfer and cryptocurrencies have especially accelerated this kind of problem because now we can transfer money across borders instantly, and there's very few checks. And I have a lot of theories, hypotheses about why there's very few checks, but banks make a lot of money off of this. Cryptocurrency exchanges make a lot of money off of it. But that's not the only reason. So the result is that law enforcement capacity and capability was never designed to scale. But criminal groups are scaling. They're using technology to scale their business just like any good business would, right? They can scale. Law enforcement and response cannot scale. You'll never have enough police officers to respond to all of the types of attacks that are going on, which means you have to do prevention. Response is not an option. But we don't like to do prevention because prevention would hurt businesses, right? So there's a bit of a trade-off that's going on here. So we have no or very unreliable reporting systems also. In most countries, there's no cybercrime reporting system at all, which means they have no data, they don't really understand the scale of it. In a lot of countries, well, in most cases anyway, most crime is not reported in every country, right? But especially cybercrime is extremely underreported in general, and then most governments don't have a system for reporting. You go to the police station, you make a report, hopefully they write it down, but there's no guarantee. Okay. So that's kind of some of the problem I'm seeing. We're getting denial of service on the police level. Prevention is not working, obviously, because the scale of the harm is just increasing every year. So I just wanted to introduce some statistics just real quick. First off is GDP per capita. You'll notice Singapore is relatively high GDP per capita. Good job. In the rest of Southeast Asia and Pacific, a little bit lower. Now this doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of development or anything like that. Your economy in Singapore is just much better. But what this does tell me is an ability to invest in each of the people, right? So whenever you look at GDP, you have to think all of the services that a government is providing comes from that amount, right? So if my GDP right now, for example, in Myanmar is that low, are they going to be able to invest in a response to cybercrime or a response to hacking? Not as much as Singapore, for example. Budgets really matter, and it's all tied to GDP. This is from Transparency International. This is the corruption index. where higher is better. Singapore, again, relatively uncorrupt. Good job. A lot of other countries, though, still struggle quite a bit with corruption. And you'll notice more on the left-hand side, the countries with a little bit lower GDP also tend to have more of a problem with corruption. Now you're thinking, okay, what's the big problem with corruption? Corruption means all of the money that was coming from here is used for something it shouldn't be used for. Okay? The tiny amount of money that existed is removed and taken somewhere else. That's basically it. The other big problem with corruption, at least from the work I do in my perspective, is the more corruption there is in a country, the more difficult it is to try to do implementation. So for example, I can come into a country and say, I want to build you a digital forensic laboratory. I'll give you all of the equipment and I will train your investigators to expert level. And then the response is, but you're going to pay us, right? I'm like, this is $1 million of investment over 3 years, but you want me to pay you per day to do this. And that stops me to be able to do the development because I can't. Like our rules say that I cannot do that, right? So those kind of things really slow down how much development we have and how much development we can do. And then this is the ICT index. So basically how developed in ICT a different country is. You notice that the development in ICT is relatively, I mean, the line is much flatter across all countries because most countries have access to technology. They have access to infrastructure. The problem is the countries, especially closer to the left, have less ability to respond. Now what I see is if you have access to technology, less ability to respond, what's going to happen? That infrastructure is going to be used to attack your companies. Right? Those people are going to be used to attack your assets. Yeah. So what's the role? Of course, my dots are all messed up. But basically what the UN does is we try to take people and educate within the context of their current development. Every country is different. Every country is developed differently. So wherever they currently are now, we try to get them as close to the maximum in their current ICT development as we possibly can. It would be impossible for me to, for example, take Myanmar and get them to the level of Singapore because technology there hasn't developed as much as it has here. Doesn't make any sense, right? So our goal, where we sit at least, is there. Okay, so access to technology and resources. First off, I want you to know digital divide is real. When you think about your cybersecurity issues, think about the digital divide. It greatly affects service quality and security in a country and region, and less security in one country will affect your organizations. Services offered without a backstop is also kind of a business risk. So I can deploy a lot of different technologies in a less developed country, but is that responsible? Because if they don't have the backing, the understanding of how social engineering works, how just basic security principles work, and I deploy that, and I know that it's going to be abused, is that responsible for my company? Now I understand companies have to expand and make money. I 100% get it. But is it responsible? Lower costs. Barrier to entry. So I forget exactly what I meant with this one, sorry. Okay. So what is the mindset shift? First off, securing people. Instead of thinking only about the technology, if you take one thing away from this today, please take away, when you look at the technology, people are behind it. There has to be. If nobody's behind the technology is pointless, right? People are behind there. Now I'm 100% guilty of this. I focused on data and I'm like, get the data right, people can sort themselves out, right? That's how I used to think. But whenever you zoom out, to the society level, it's all related. So, securing people. Securing technology secures people. Yes, you can scale that way, especially if a lot of users are using your technology, but it's not where you should be focused on. Putting people as assets in our risk model at a very high level. Think about people as assets, because they're essentially right now just completely almost ignored. More focus on decentralized security models. If you look at a society, the way that we have these people around, it's just a node, decentralized node, right? So we need more decentralized security models. Gatekeepers keep a population insecure. Whenever you do it at the very highest levels, centralization just does not work. And then, of course, on my side, international cooperation. International cooperation really can't be centralized. You have sovereign governments. You can have some groups above kind of helping them, but basically each government is going to fight for its identity. So it's non-centralized, so international cooperation can't be centralized. And we need to optimize working together. Governments, again, don't really like to work together very much. With data sharing and faster processing. This is a really interesting area. If anyone has the ability to work on it more, I'm happy to support. Governments still send printed documents via like a diplomatic pouch, via mail, physically open it and then scan it into a system asking for a request for assistance. So the process to actually do international cooperation formally normally takes about a year to make the request and receive a reply. The cybercrime happened in 20 seconds. The money transferred to a different country in 30 seconds. But if law enforcement want to receive the case and then go to another country and then get evidence from another country, 1 year. Because they're still working pre-internet legal systems. Okay? This is a major area where the technology has not gotten into the legal system at all. And then overall, helping to reduce corruption. If we can reduce corruption, everyone will be more secure, first off, because you have less risk coming from all of these potentially compromised channels. And more powerful organized crime is a risk for everyone. You might think that organized crime doesn't affect you. It absolutely affects you. Right now we're seeing, for example, from the old POGOs, the casinos that were kind of started in Philippines, they have transferred from casinos to online crime, especially scam centers. They're making so much money now that they're essentially buying private companies and parts of the government. Once they control parts of the government, organized crime controls everything. Now, if they continue to make as much money as they're making, it's only a matter of time before that corruption will eventually start seeping into other countries. Singapore, high GDP, it's relatively difficult to access. Your barrier to entry is very high, but it's not impossible, right? Other countries right now, much easier to access. Start taking over governments in each country, and then it eventually leads somewhere. It affects us. The more resources organized crime has, the worse it is for everyone. Now, technology is really helping them, especially generative AI and things like this, because now scams look really convincing, and just different types of crime that we've been working on are kind of supercharged with some new technologies that have come out recently. But I see that and I'm like, okay, technology advances, it's always the pendulum, right? Something comes out, we respond, kind of goes the other way. I totally believe in the pendulum because I've seen it multiple times. This is just technology disrupting the market. And criminals are also using the same market. I understand. We will find a solution to this. My problem isn't the technology. It's that the technology, whenever it's being abused, is severely hurting so many people in so many places like crime never has before. Right? This virtual crime, we can touch anyone, and it is touching everyone, and people are literally killing themselves over it. right? This is what we have to solve immediately. The technology, I'm confident, will balance out. But how do we protect people in the meantime? Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have a Q&A session or not. I'm totally happy to take questions.
Yes, so we'll have a mic to go around. Any of you who may have questions, please raise and we'll come to you.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It's very interesting. And I was wondering, the only thing that we have is for prevention is like teaching people is the only answer that we have right now.
A lot of people focus a lot on teaching people for prevention. And I guess to that I would say, how many times have you told somebody not to download a PDF from somebody
that
that's
the
didn't know?
point.
Yep. It doesn't work. So a lot of the education, like definitely awareness raising can make a difference. But the way that we implement awareness raising isn't the way that people think, right? And the way that we have implemented user interfaces especially makes it easy to not think, right? Because we're just going through the motions of our work and then we see a PDF. Well, we've downloaded 60 PDFs today. What's another one going to be, right? So the way that we kind of channel our workflows and the way that we set that up, we talked a little bit earlier today about like adding friction in certain points. So there's a whole security research area on adding friction. Security in general tends to like to put rules, and then we like to put roadblocks. But that makes the work of everyone a little bit more difficult. So that's a hard one. I would say awareness raising is absolutely necessary because everyone needs to know essentially what the risks are. But you're never going to have people that are in-depth thinking about every single email or text or whatever. And that's where the technology could be a lot better. So we can do more on the technology side that's still relatively seamless. Pair that with education and awareness, but also just we really need cultural shift. Now, I mean, I know I'm sounding very, very cynical. I'm also old enough to know that the internet is super young, right? We really just started using technology like this very, very recently. So the awareness level of most people is almost nothing because it's so new. And I think especially if we're in this all the time, we just assume that everyone knows this stuff because we're in it. This will change with time as people just grow up with all of these things that are going on now, and that's still new. So I think it's going to get better naturally as people get more kind of conscientious of it and more systems become available. But yeah, awareness and then really looking at the research on security awareness. Like, for example, those phishing emails where people get, you send out a phish in your organization, and then if you clicked on the link, you get a training. Those have been shown to be terrible, like terrible. They don't work. So look at the actual research that's coming out from the social side, because from the technology side, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. On the social side, what did people learn from this? They learned they hate clicking on emails from the organization. They basically hate the organization more. That's the only thing that results from it. So really look at the social research while you're trying to implement technologies, and I think we don't connect those enough. So it's a bad answer because I'm still struggling with it too. I'm struggling. Yep.
Sorry, we have a question here first.
Hi, James. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Kim Hock from Whistling. After hearing your presentation, I feel more depressed than before. You're coming from United Nations and you are saying that, the government, between government, they do not cooperate. If this is the case, I would see the cybercrime and drug and also child abuse, we can get more serious. So do you see any light at the end of tunnel in the coming futures? That's my questions. Thank you.
Yep. Sorry to depress you. But I am an optimist, I have to say. I think you can't really work in this space without being an optimist. Is it getting better? If you look at legislation for every country right now, you can pretty much tell where the thinking is in terms of technology, in terms of security. Okay, so countries that have strong legislation on cyber aspects, digital evidence, things like that, are usually more willing and more open to deal with cybercrime at an international level. A little bit. At least they're talking about it. But the thing that I've learned about legislation is it is so far behind technology, right? And that's because the way that governments work is so far behind the people normally, right? The people are doing something and then the government essentially is responding. That's how most governments actually work, because it's a big thing. Now, if we combine that with the fact that most governments have also only had access to technology for a few years, they're still figuring out what their response is going to be in most cases. Now, Singapore did extremely well, like it's really trying to be the forefront of this. But other countries are just now coming to terms with what technology means. And once they really understand what technology means, if we can also address kind of corruption a little bit more, then international cooperation will come naturally, because now we have the technology to be able to do instant cooperation between governments. Why aren't they implementing it? Because of politics, a little bit, but also because I don't think there's really been an identification of a need of cross-jurisdictional, real-time collaboration that wasn't already solved with task force. So sometimes if we identify a problem between two countries, like a criminal group working, a task force between two countries will be created, and that task force can work with each other real time. But for a standard cybercrime, task force don't usually work unless you're talking about an organized group that you're targeting, right? So there's a bit of a change in the way that criminal groups are working, and a lot of this change happened during COVID, because they were losing so much money from traditional crime channels like drugs. They had to physically move those things. That became much more difficult. So they diversified their portfolio into online crime. So it's only since COVID that this has really taken off a lot more, and the business model's changed. Now, governments are already starting to react to it, but it's these kinds of things that are going to push governments to be more efficient in terms of international cooperation. Our main challenge is that politics will always be an issue, right? Politics will always be an issue, and that's something else. But I absolutely see governments shifting towards more collaboration because they're desperate. And no government can do it alone anymore. But that is exactly the opposite of the way that most governments talk, right? Governments want to work for the country. And then you come to them and say, actually, you kind of have to work for everyone, otherwise you're in trouble too. So it's a bit of a shift in mindset, but I think that mindset shift will be forced because of the way that criminal actors are working. So I'm optimistic. Please don't be depressed. Okay.
Hi, James. I'm David. I'm from ITSEC.
Hello.
I'm trying to figure out the threat actor, so the organized crime. So they are after money, is that all? That's one question. The other question is, how much or how well are they infiltrated into the local economy, like for example, Singapore or Malaysia? Will they cause bodily harm to people like us? If, for example, if we can harness all the energy in this room to fight back, what sort of harm will they cause us? Thank you.
Okay, that's a lot. That's a big question. It's not just money laundering, although money laundering, think of organized crime like a business. They have to make money. That's going to be their priority. So usually established money laundering channels are the channels that they want to focus on. That's where they're securing most things. And there's already very well established money laundering channels because of basically drug trade and maybe human trafficking. those existing criminal paths already had money flows set up, and then online crime are using the same money laundering channels that these traditional crime paths used. Okay? Now, so it's not just money laundering. It's all forms of crime that can potentially take money. We are seeing more of a service model, just like we see in hacking, right? So different services will be offered by different criminal organizations. And then in terms of how much of an impact do they have on countries, it 100% depends on how deep they are into a country. So for example, Singapore, organized crime, I'm sure, is here, for example. They work like normal businesses. They buy businesses. They buy assets in countries a lot. So definitely in Singapore, something is here, but I don't specifically know what it is. In other countries, a little bit more, where they can spend a little bit less but get more access. That's where they're going to be doing it. As long as they're protecting their assets, which is the money flow, they will invest. So in terms of danger of bodily harm, yeah, I mean, it's a real risk. Now, information security community, I don't normally see gangsters going after InfoSec people too much. Maybe because we're always in our offices hiding away, I don't know. But there's a real risk, right? If you are disrupting a billion-dollar company, the billion-dollar company will go after you, whether it's organized crime or not, right? The means that they use to do that will be a little bit different. So we are disrupting, or we're trying to disrupt these flows, and that will have consequences. The average person, I don't think, has to worry about it. Judges really do. Lawmakers really do. Police really have to worry about it. Yeah, that's what I'd say. Thank you.
All right, we'll have one more question before we break for a short break.
Good morning, James. Thanks for your time today. Quick question. I was wondering if you could comment on the evolving tradecraft of cyber actors operating in Southeast Asia and how that might actually compare and contrast amongst your colleagues' perspectives on, say, South America, Europe, Eastern Bloc, broadly.
Thank you. That's a very well-formed question. I'm interested where you're from. Yeah, let's say for the business models that are scaling up, it's really going to service models way more than it used to. So for example, the scam operations might be working out of a particular scam center in a particular country, but then the advertising for the malware that's used is set up in a different area from a different group, and then all of these are paid services. So kind of like we saw with hacking and ransomware service models kind of forming out several years ago, now different criminal groups, like traditional organized crime groups that were normally physical, they're starting to use those service models a lot more because service models are really good. You specialize in one thing, you're really good in that one thing, and you sell that service, right? Before, organized groups would kind of do everything. So what I would say is in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, it's more service model creation around all of the different, let's say, workflows that you would have to do to exploit. Usually around scams is the big one that's growing, but it's not just scams. Ransomware is still a massive issue. Like all of these other kind of traditional crimes that were already here are still a problem. The discussion around scams is because it has such an economic impact and it's scaling up really fast. Now what I see in terms of Africa, Latin America, those service models are being exported there. We don't know if they're exactly the same groups teaching people how to do it or whether they're just identifying it as a service opportunity and saying we can do it from here too, and then they're focusing services on particular languages and markets more than others. But it's replicating out, and it seems to be replicating from the Mekong because this is kind of the place where it really started to experiment and take off, like I said, during COVID, but it's being exported now. So it looks like the other regions are following. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.